He thought she was wasting his time, but 10 minutes later, the entire bank would discover that the quiet woman they ignored was the most important customer in the building. The morning rush had already filled the downtown branch of Sterling National Bank. Customers stood in orderly lines beneath bright lights reflecting off polished marble floors. Digital screens displayed market updates. Private offices lined the far side of the lobby behind glass walls. Employees moved quickly between service desks, while managers monitored operations from a distance. It was the kind of place designed to inspire confidence. Every detail communicated professionalism, stability, and success. At precisely 9:15 in the morning, Helen Whitmore stepped through the front entrance carrying a worn leather handbag. At 63 years old, she looked more like a retired schoolteacher than someone visiting one of the largest financial institutions in the state. Her light gray coat was simple. Her shoes were practical rather than fashionable. Nothing about her appearance attracted attention. In fact, most people barely noticed her at all. Helen paused for a moment inside the lobby and quietly observed the activity around her. She watched customers being greeted by employees. She noticed which clients received immediate attention and which were asked to wait. She noticed the subtle differences in tone, body language, and patience. Small details often revealed much larger truths. After taking a numbered ticket from the kiosk, she walked toward the waiting area and sat near a large window overlooking the city street. Outside, commuters hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Inside, the bank buzzed with activity. Helen folded her hands calmly across her handbag and waited. A young employee glanced toward her before turning attention to a sharply dressed businessman who had entered several minutes later. Another customer was escorted directly into a private office. Helen simply watched. She did not complain. She did not appear frustrated. Instead, she seemed interested, almost curious. Across the lobby, Richard Bennett stood inside a glass-walled office reviewing reports on a tablet. As branch manager, he carried responsibility for one of the bank's highest-performing locations. He took pride in maintaining efficiency, professionalism, and an image that reflected success. Every morning began with performance numbers, customer metrics, and operational updates. Today was no different. Richard briefly scanned the lobby through the office windows. His eyes passed over dozens of customers. They paused for only a second when they reached Helen. Then he returned to his work. To him, she appeared unremarkable. Another routine visitor. Another customer needing routine assistance. Nothing more. Meanwhile, Helen continued observing. She noticed an elderly man struggling to understand a form. She noticed an employee who seemed rushed and impatient. She noticed another who offered genuine kindness to every customer regardless of appearance. Helen smiled faintly at that. Character mattered. It always had. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Several customers who arrived after Helen had already completed their transactions. One woman wearing expensive jewelry was personally greeted by name. A businessman carrying a luxury briefcase received immediate assistance. Helen remained seated, calm, patient, unbothered. Eventually, she checked the number displayed on the service screen. Her ticket still had not been called. A nearby customer glanced toward her. "You have been waiting a while." Helen smiled politely. "That is all right." The customer shrugged and returned to his phone. Another 10 minutes passed. Helen quietly looked around the branch once more. There was no anger in her expression, only observation. She seemed to be studying something beyond the banking procedures themselves, as if she were measuring the culture hidden beneath them. Near the front desk, two employees discussed an upcoming client meeting involving a major investment account. The conversation caught Helen's attention briefly. Then she returned to watching the lobby. Across the room, Richard finally emerged from his office and began walking through the branch. Employees straightened as he passed. Customers recognized him immediately as the person in charge. He greeted several important clients by name before stopping near the service desks. For the first time that morning, his attention settled fully on Helen Whitmore sitting quietly by the window. Neither of them knew it yet, but within the next 10 minutes, a single decision would change the atmosphere of the entire bank. Helen Whitmore continued waiting near the large window, while the activity inside the branch flowed around her like a river moving past an unnoticed stone. Her number remained uncalled. Customers arrived, completed transactions, and departed. Some were greeted by name the moment they entered. Others were escorted directly to private offices without ever approaching the main service desks. Helen watched everything quietly. The longer she observed, the more she noticed. An employee rushed through a conversation with an elderly customer who needed help understanding account paperwork. Another representative spent nearly 15 minutes speaking warmly with a client wearing an expensive suit. The difference was subtle enough that most people would never have recognized it, yet Helen saw it clearly. Across the lobby, Richard Bennett continued moving through the branch, greeting preferred clients and monitoring operations. He took pride in efficiency. From his perspective, the morning appeared successful. Employees were busy. Customers were being served. Business was moving smoothly. Yet he failed to notice one important detail. The woman who had entered nearly an hour earlier was still waiting. Helen glanced down at the numbered ticket resting in her hand. Then she looked toward the digital display mounted above the service counters. Several numbers higher than hers had already been called. She did not complain. She simply made a mental note. A young teller eventually noticed her and offered a brief smile. "Have you been helped yet?" Helen returned the smile. "Not yet." The teller looked surprised. "Someone should be with you soon." Helen thanked her. The young woman seemed sincere. That mattered. Character often revealed itself through small gestures. A few minutes later, another customer sat beside Helen while waiting for an appointment. He was a middle-aged businessman carrying a leather portfolio. "Busy morning," he said casually. Helen nodded. "It certainly is." The man laughed. "Sometimes it feels like the only way to get attention in places like this is to have $1 million. Helen smiled softly. "You might be surprised how often people assume that." The man chuckled and returned to reading emails on his phone. Nearby, two relationship managers discussed a high-profile investment client, expected to complete a major transaction later that week. Their conversation was impossible to miss. Words like strategic account, executive approval, and priority service floated through the lobby. Employees seemed excited. Richard personally joined the discussion for several moments before returning toward the private offices. Helen listened quietly before turning her attention elsewhere. Another 20 minutes passed. Eventually her number finally appeared on the screen. She stood, collected her handbag, and approached the service desk. The representative assigned to assist her appeared young and slightly nervous. "Good morning. How may I help you today?" Helen placed a folder on the desk. "I would like assistance with a transfer." The employee opened the folder and immediately looked confused. Several pages of financial documents rested inside. The requested amount was substantial, far beyond the typical transaction handled at the counter. The employee blinked twice and reviewed the paperwork again. "One moment, please." Helen nodded patiently. The representative stood and disappeared into a nearby office. Several minutes later, she returned accompanied by a supervisor. The supervisor studied the documents carefully before looking at Helen. Then he looked at her coat, her handbag, her modest appearance. The uncertainty on his face was obvious. "May I ask where these documents came from?" he said cautiously. Helen answered calmly. "From my financial advisors." The supervisor hesitated. He clearly did not know what to make of her. The amount listed on the paperwork suggested enormous assets. Yet the woman standing before him looked nothing like the wealthy clients he imagined. Finally, the supervisor glanced toward Richard Bennett's office. "I think we should involve the branch manager." Helen simply nodded. Across the lobby, Richard noticed the supervisor approaching. A brief conversation followed. The supervisor handed him the folder and pointed toward Helen. Richard opened the documents. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he reviewed the figures. Then his eyes moved from the paperwork to the quiet woman waiting patiently near the service desk. For the second time that morning, he looked at Helen Whitmore. This time, however, he was no longer seeing just another customer. He was seeing a question he did not yet know how to answer. Richard Bennett studied the documents for several moments before closing the folder and walking toward the service desk. The branch around him continued operating as usual. Customers spoke quietly with tellers. Phones rang behind office doors. Employees moved from station to station carrying paperwork and tablets. Yet for Helen Whitmore, the atmosphere had begun to shift. Several employees were now glancing in her direction. Curiosity was spreading. The numbers inside the folder had attracted attention. Richard stopped in front of her and offered a professional smile. "Good morning. I am Richard Bennett, branch manager." Helen returned the smile. "Nice to meet you." Richard opened the folder again. "I understand you would like assistance with a transfer." "Yes. This is a significant transaction." "It is." Richard studied her carefully. The amount listed would normally involve high-level account verification and private consultation. Yet something about the situation felt wrong to him. The paperwork suggested extraordinary wealth. The woman standing before him did not fit the image he associated with clients who moved that kind of money. He glanced at her simple coat and worn handbag before returning his attention to the documents. "May I ask where you currently bank?" Helen answered calmly. "Several institutions." Richard nodded slowly. "And this transfer is connected to one of those accounts?" "Yes." Every answer was direct and confident. That should have reassured him. Instead, it made him more suspicious. Around them, employees continued working while quietly paying attention to the conversation. Richard stepped slightly closer to the service desk. "Mrs. Whitmore, transactions of this size usually require extensive verification." Helen nodded. "I understand. There are procedures we must follow." "Of course." Richard expected resistance. He expected frustration. Instead, Helen remained completely composed. Somehow that unsettled him even more. He flipped through several pages. Everything appeared professionally prepared. Financial statements, authorization forms, supporting documentation. Yet his doubts remained. Who prepared these materials? Helen smiled politely. "My advisors." Richard glanced toward the supervisor standing nearby. The supervisor offered a subtle shrug. Nothing in the paperwork appeared obviously wrong. Yet neither of them seemed willing to trust what they were seeing. Finally, Richard closed the folder. "I think there may be some issues we need to clarify before proceeding." Helen looked at him quietly. "What kind of issues?" Richard hesitated. He did not have a specific answer. The documents were complete. The forms appeared valid. The problem existed entirely in his assumptions. Yet he did not recognize that. "Not yet. The information here requires additional review." Helen nodded. "Then please review it." The response caught him off guard. Once again, she refused to become emotional. She refused to argue. She simply remained patient. Nearby, several customers had begun paying attention. One teller stopped typing for a moment. Another employee pretended to organize paperwork while listening closely. Richard could feel their eyes on him. He wanted to demonstrate authority. He wanted to show that procedures mattered. Most of all, he wanted to avoid making a mistake. Ironically, that desire was leading him directly toward one. "Perhaps," Richard said carefully, "we should postpone this until additional documentation can be provided." Helen tilted her head slightly. "Additional documentation?" "Yes." "What documentation is missing?" Richard opened the folder again. He searched for an answer. Any answer. Yet every required document appeared to be present. The silence stretched longer than he intended. Helen noticed. So did everyone else. Finally she spoke. "Is there a problem with the paperwork?" Richard looked up. "No." "Is there a problem with the authorization?" "No." "Then what exactly is preventing the transfer?" The question hung in the air. Several employees exchanged nervous glances. Richard felt the pressure building. He could not explain his concerns because they were not based on evidence. They were based on appearances. And appearances are difficult to defend when facts say otherwise. Still, instead of stepping back, he leaned further into his assumptions. "I simply believe additional review would be appropriate." Helen studied him quietly for several seconds. Then she gave a small nod. "I see." There was no anger in her voice. No disappointment. Just understanding. Somehow that made Richard even more uncomfortable. Because for the first time that morning, a small part of him began wondering whether the woman standing before him knew something that everyone else in the branch had completely missed. Helen Whitmore remained standing beside the service desk while Richard Bennett held the folder in his hands. Around them, the normal rhythm of the bank continued, but the conversation had quietly become the center of attention. Employees pretended to focus on their work while listening carefully. A few customers glanced in their direction before quickly looking away. Nobody wanted to appear interested. Everyone was interested. Richard reviewed the documents one more time. Every page seemed complete. Every signature appeared correct. Every requirement had been satisfied. Yet he still could not shake the feeling that something about the situation did not fit. In reality, the only thing that seemed out of place was Helen herself. Her appearance did not match the story the paperwork was telling. And because of that, Richard continued searching for reasons to delay the transaction. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, placing the folder on the counter. "Transactions of this nature are normally handled through specialized relationship managers." Helen nodded politely. "Then I would be happy to speak with one." Richard hesitated. "Unfortunately, they are unavailable at the moment." Helen glanced toward several glass offices where employees were clearly working. She said nothing. The silence itself felt like a question. Richard continued. "We may need to schedule an appointment for another day." "Another day?" Helen asked gently. "Yes. I was informed this could be completed today." Richard forced a professional smile. "Certain circumstances require additional review." Once again, the explanation sounded reasonable. Yet it remained frustratingly vague. Helen looked at him calmly. "You have reviewed the documents?" "Yes." "You confirmed that everything appears complete?" "Yes." "Then what exactly requires review?" The question landed with quiet precision. Richard felt several employees watching from nearby workstations. He did not have a convincing answer. The truth was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. The paperwork was not the issue. The transaction was not the issue. Helen was the issue. Or more accurately, his assumptions about her were. Still, instead of admitting uncertainty, he doubled down. "I do not believe we can proceed at this time." The words immediately changed the atmosphere. A hush seemed to settle across the service area. Helen remained perfectly still. "You are refusing the transaction?" Richard folded his arms. "I am postponing it until additional verification can be completed." Helen studied him for several seconds. There was no anger in her eyes. No embarrassment. No frustration. If anything, she seemed almost disappointed. Not for herself. For him. Nearby, the young teller who had spoken kindly to Helen earlier lowered her eyes. Even she seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Richard noticed but ignored it. He believed he was protecting the bank. Protecting procedures. Protecting standards. The fact that he was making a decision based on appearances never fully entered his mind. Helen slowly closed the folder and placed it back inside her handbag. The movement was calm and deliberate. Richard expected an argument. He expected a complaint. Most customers would have demanded explanations. Helen did neither. Instead, she reached into her handbag and removed a small mobile phone. Then she looked at Richard one final time. "Very well." Richard nodded, relieved the conversation appeared to be ending. Helen calmly dialed a number. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. She spoke quietly enough that nobody could hear the details. "Good morning," she said. "I am at the downtown Sterling branch." "Yes. I believe there has been a misunderstanding." "Thank you." Then she ended the call and returned the phone to her handbag. Richard watched curiously. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Helen smiled politely. "No. I believe someone else will be helping shortly." The answer felt strange. Before Richard could respond, Helen walked back to the waiting area near the window and resumed her seat. She folded her hands across her handbag exactly as she had done earlier. Calm. Patient. Untroubled. Around the branch, conversations slowly resumed. Employees returned to their stations. Customers continued their transactions. The moment appeared to have passed. Yet 10 minutes had just started counting down. And while Richard returned to his office believing the matter was settled, events were already unfolding beyond the walls of the branch. Events that would soon force everyone inside the building to see Helen Whitmore very differently. Helen Whitmore sat quietly beside the large window as sunlight reflected across the polished floor of the bank. The morning crowd continued moving through the branch, unaware that something important had already been set into motion. Her brief phone call had lasted less than 30 seconds. She had spoken calmly. She had made no threats. She had raised no complaints. Yet there was a certainty in her voice that suggested she knew exactly what would happen next. Across the lobby, Richard Bennett returned to his office feeling confident that he had handled a potentially suspicious situation correctly. He placed Helen's file on his desk and opened his email. Quarterly reports required review. Staff performance metrics needed approval. Several meetings filled the remainder of his schedule. As far as he was concerned, the matter was finished. The woman had been told the transaction could not proceed. Procedures had been followed. The branch could move on. Yet even as he tried to focus on other tasks, something continued bothering him. Helen's reaction had been unusual. Most customers became frustrated when denied service. Some argued. Others demanded supervisors. A few threatened to close accounts. Helen had done none of those things. She had simply made a phone call and returned to her seat. The calmness felt strangely unsettling. Meanwhile, employees throughout the branch quietly discussed the encounter. The young teller who had first spoken with Helen felt uncomfortable. Several supervisors privately admitted they had expected some form of confrontation. Instead, there had been silence. The silence seemed far more powerful than anger would have been. Near the customer service desks, two employees glanced occasionally toward Helen. She appeared completely at peace. She looked out the window. She occasionally checked the time. Once, she smiled at a child waiting with his mother nearby. There was no sign of anxiety, no indication that anything had gone wrong. Almost 10 minutes passed. Then the first sign appeared. Richard's office phone rang. He answered without looking away from his computer screen. Richard Bennett. The expression on his face changed almost immediately. "Good morning," he said, sitting upright. "How can I help you?" The voice on the other end belonged to someone from corporate headquarters. Richard recognized the name instantly. Senior leadership rarely contacted branch managers directly. When they did, people paid attention. Richard listened carefully. His confidence slowly faded. "Yes," he replied. "I understand." Several seconds passed. "A client." His eyes moved instinctively toward the lobby. "Yes, she is here." Richard's posture stiffened. "Right now." The person on the other end continued speaking. Richard glanced toward the folder resting on his desk. A feeling of unease began spreading through his chest. "I see." Another pause followed. Then his face grew noticeably pale. "You are certain?" The answer apparently left no room for doubt. Richard swallowed hard. "Of course." When the call finally ended, he remained motionless for several seconds. Outside his office, employees continued working, unaware that something extraordinary had just happened. Richard slowly picked up the folder and opened it again. This time he looked more carefully. Names, account references, financial institutions, investment entities. Details that had seemed ordinary now appeared completely different. A second phone call arrived almost immediately. Then a third. By now several employees had noticed the sudden change in his demeanor. One supervisor approached the office door. Richard looked up. "Please gather the senior staff." The supervisor frowned. "Is something wrong?" Richard hesitated. "I think we may have made a mistake." Those words spread through the branch faster than any announcement could have. Employees exchanged nervous looks. Conversations slowed. A sense of uncertainty filled the air. Across the lobby, Helen remained seated by the window. Calm, patient, unmoved. She watched the branch with the same quiet attention she had shown all morning. Then her eyes briefly met Richard's through the glass wall of his office. For the first time since she arrived, he was no longer looking at her with doubt. He was looking at her with concern. Because whatever corporate headquarters had just told him, it was enough to make him realize that the simple woman everyone overlooked was not who they thought she was. The atmosphere inside the branch had changed completely, although most customers could not yet explain why. Conversations grew quieter. Employees moved with unusual urgency. Several supervisors gathered near Richard Bennett's office after receiving instructions to attend an immediate meeting. Nobody knew the full story. They only knew that corporate headquarters had called multiple times within a matter of minutes. That alone was enough to make people nervous. Richard stood behind his desk staring at the open file. The documents he had questioned earlier now carried a very different meaning. Names that seemed unfamiliar before were suddenly impossible to ignore. Investment firms, trust accounts, strategic partnerships. The deeper he looked, the worse he felt. Every piece of information confirmed the same reality. Helen Whitmore was not simply a customer. She was one of the most important financial clients connected to the institution. A supervisor entered the office. "Everyone is ready." Richard nodded and followed him into the conference room. Inside, several department leaders sat around a polished table. Some looked concerned. Others appeared confused. Richard closed the door behind him. For a moment he struggled to find the right words. Finally, he placed Helen's file on the table. "We have a situation." The room immediately fell silent. One manager frowned. "What kind of situation?" Richard took a slow breath. "The client we delayed this morning is connected to accounts valued in the hundreds of millions." Several heads lifted instantly. One supervisor blinked. "Hundreds of millions?" Richard nodded. "Possibly more." Nobody spoke. The number seemed almost impossible to process. Another manager opened the file and began reviewing the information personally. His expression changed within seconds. "This cannot be right." Richard wished it were not. Yet the phone calls from headquarters had confirmed everything. One executive after another had contacted the branch asking the same question. Why was Helen Whitmore experiencing delays? Why had her transaction not been completed? Why had the branch manager personally intervened? Nobody in the room had a good answer. Back in the main lobby, Helen remained seated beside the window. She appeared completely unaffected by the growing tension around her. The young teller who had spoken kindly to her earlier approached cautiously. "Mrs. Whitmore, can I get you some coffee or water while you wait?" Helen smiled warmly. "That is very thoughtful. Water would be lovely." The teller returned moments later with a bottle of water. Helen thanked her sincerely. The simple exchange did not go unnoticed. Other employees were beginning to understand that Helen treated everyone with equal respect regardless of position. Meanwhile, inside the conference room, a senior executive from headquarters joined by video call. The screen illuminated the wall at the front of the room. Every manager immediately sat straighter. The executive wasted no time. "I understand Mrs. Whitmore is currently in your branch." Richard answered carefully. "Yes." "Has her transaction been completed?" The silence that followed provided the answer. The executive's expression hardened. "Do you understand who she is?" Richard hesitated. "We are beginning to." The executive shook his head. "No, I do not think you are." Several managers exchanged worried glances. The executive continued. "Mrs. Whitmore oversees one of the largest private investment groups associated with this institution. Her companies have maintained relationships with us for decades. Entire divisions know her by name." The room became absolutely still. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Every sentence made the situation worse. "Her accounts are reviewed directly at the highest levels of the organization," the executive said. "When she called this morning, people listened. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke." Across the hall, beyond the conference room walls, Helen sat quietly near the window looking out at the city. She appeared exactly the same as when she first entered the bank. The same simple coat, the same worn handbag, the same calm expression. Yet now everyone was beginning to understand something remarkable. The woman they had overlooked all morning had never needed wealth to prove her value. The wealth was simply there. What truly mattered was the character they had failed to recognize. And within the next few minutes, the full truth about Helen Whitmore would force every person in the branch to confront their own assumptions. The conference room remained silent long after the executive finished speaking. No one seemed eager to break the tension. The truth had arrived all at once, and every person present was still trying to absorb it. Richard Bennett stared at the file resting on the table. Only an hour earlier, it had looked suspicious to him. Now it looked like evidence of his own failure. Around him, department managers exchanged uneasy glances. Some reviewed the documents again, hoping they had misunderstood something. They had not. The information was real. The client sitting quietly in their lobby was connected to financial assets beyond anything most people in the room would ever personally manage. Yet what troubled them most was not the size of the accounts. It was the fact that she had never once mentioned them. The executive on the screen spoke again. Open the priority client profile. One of the supervisors immediately accessed the system. A few moments later, Helen Whitmore's profile appeared on the large monitor. Several people leaned forward. The account overview filled the screen. Then additional records appeared. Long-term investment partnerships, major institutional holdings, strategic trust accounts, historical client relationships spanning decades. Every page seemed more significant than the last. One manager quietly shook his head. My goodness. Another supervisor stared at the screen in disbelief. She has been with the bank longer than most of us have worked here. The executive nodded. Much longer. More information appeared. Philanthropic foundations, scholarship programs, community development projects, donations supporting hospitals, schools, and local businesses. The room grew even quieter. The picture becoming visible was completely different from the assumptions everyone had made. Helen was not simply wealthy. She was respected. Her influence extended far beyond money. Entire communities had benefited from projects she funded. Hundreds of people had opportunities because of her work. Yet she had entered the branch carrying a worn handbag and wearing a simple gray coat. No security team. No assistant. No special treatment. Just quiet dignity. Richard felt his stomach sink further with every passing second. He remembered the moment she asked what documentation was missing. He remembered searching for an answer he could not provide. He remembered refusing a transaction without evidence because something about her appearance had not matched his expectations. Across the room, one supervisor finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Why did she not identify herself? The executive smiled faintly. Because she never does. Nobody spoke. The answer somehow made the situation worse. Helen had not hidden who she was. She simply expected to be treated like any other customer. The branch had failed that test. Back in the lobby, Helen continued sitting beside the window. Several employees now looked at her differently. Word had not spread completely, but enough people sensed that something extraordinary was happening. The young teller who brought her water earlier noticed that Helen remained exactly the same. She was not checking account balances. She was not demanding apologies. She was not seeking attention. She simply waited. Inside the conference room, another file opened on the screen. This one displayed communication records from headquarters, senior executives, regional directors, wealth management leadership. Several names carried titles so high that many branch employees had never interacted with them directly. Every one of them knew Helen Whitmore. Every one of them treated her with enormous respect. Richard closed his eyes briefly. He finally understood the magnitude of the mistake. This was never about wealth. The wealth only revealed the assumptions that had already been made. Had Helen possessed a small account, she still deserved the same respect. That realization hurt more than anything else. A notification suddenly appeared on the conference room screen. Another executive was joining the call. The moment the connection opened, several managers immediately recognized him. He rarely participated in branch-level matters. The room straightened instinctively. The executive looked directly into the camera. I understand Mrs. Whitmore is still waiting in your lobby. Richard answered quietly. Yes. The executive paused. Then perhaps it is time for everyone there to understand exactly who she is. The room fell silent once again. Because whatever came next would completely erase any remaining doubt about the simple woman they had underestimated from the moment she walked through the front doors. The executive on the screen folded his hands and looked around the conference room with a seriousness that immediately commanded attention. Every manager sat silently waiting. Richard Bennett could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The executive finally spoke. Many people know Mrs. Whitmore because of her financial relationships with this institution. That is only part of the story. The room remained completely still. Another file appeared on the screen. Photographs replaced account summaries. Images of schools, hospitals, community centers, small businesses opening their doors, scholarship recipients standing proudly beside graduation banners, charitable foundations serving neighborhoods across the country. The managers stared at the images in surprise. Over the last 25 years, the executive continued, Mrs. Whitmore has quietly funded projects that have improved thousands of lives. No one interrupted. She rarely attends ceremonies. She avoids publicity whenever possible. Most people benefiting from her generosity never even know her name. The silence deepened. Richard felt another wave of regret. The woman he had dismissed as unimportant had spent decades helping people she would never meet. Meanwhile, he had spent less than 10 minutes judging her based on appearances. Across the lobby, Helen Whitmore remained seated near the window. The sunlight had shifted slightly across the floor. She looked exactly as she had when she first entered the bank. Nothing about her posture suggested wealth or influence. She simply appeared comfortable being herself. Inside the conference room, one manager quietly shook his head. Why does she dress so simply? The executive smiled. Because she has nothing to prove. Nobody spoke after that. The answer seemed to explain everything. Another executive joined the call and added additional information. Helen served on advisory boards. She supported educational programs. She invested in businesses that created jobs in struggling communities. Yet despite all of her success, she routinely visited institutions without announcing who she was. She believes character is revealed when people think no one important is watching. The executive explained. Richard lowered his eyes. Those words felt directed specifically at him. The uncomfortable truth was impossible to escape. Nobody in the branch had failed because Helen was wealthy. They had failed because they treated her differently before knowing anything about her. The money merely exposed the mistake. A supervisor sitting near the end of the table finally asked the question everyone was thinking. What should we do now? The executive looked directly at Richard through the camera. Start by treating her the way every customer should have been treated from the beginning. No one disagreed. Moments later, the meeting ended. The conference room remained quiet as people processed everything they had learned. Richard slowly stood. He picked up Helen's file and walked toward the door. Several managers followed. Employees throughout the branch noticed the group emerging from the conference room together. Conversations faded. Phones seemed quieter. The atmosphere felt different. As Richard crossed the lobby, he saw Helen sitting peacefully by the window. She noticed him approaching and offered the same polite smile she had shown all morning. There was no bitterness in her expression, no satisfaction, no sign that she enjoyed watching others struggle with their mistakes. That somehow made the moment even harder. Richard stopped a few feet away. For several seconds he simply stood there. Every employee nearby watched quietly. The young teller who had shown kindness earlier looked on with nervous anticipation. Helen closed the book she had been reading and looked up. Her eyes were steady, calm, patient. Richard realized she had likely known the truth from the very beginning. She knew what would happen after the phone call. She knew headquarters would respond. Yet she had never threatened anyone. She had never raised her voice. She had simply waited. And now, standing before her beneath the bright lights of the branch, Richard finally understood that the most powerful person in the building had been the quiet woman everyone overlooked the moment she walked through the front door. Richard Bennett stopped in front of Helen Whitmore, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The busy sounds of the branch seemed distant now. Employees watched quietly from behind service counters. Managers stood nearby. Customers sensed that something important was happening even if they did not know the details. Helen looked up from her chair with the same calm expression she had worn all morning. Richard held her file carefully in both hands. The confidence that had defined him earlier was gone. In its place stood a man confronting an uncomfortable truth about himself. Finally he spoke. Mrs. Whitmore, I owe you an apology. The words immediately drew the attention of everyone within earshot. Richard continued. This morning I made assumptions I should never have made. I questioned you when I should have listened. I delayed helping you when I should have focused on the facts in front of me. Helen listened quietly. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. I am sorry. The branch fell silent. Nobody expected the manager of the bank to apologize so openly. Yet everyone knew the apology was deserved. Helen studied him for several seconds. Then she smiled gently. It was not the smile of someone who had won a battle. It was the smile of someone who understood human nature. "Thank you, Richard," she said softly. The tension throughout the lobby eased slightly. Richard nodded. "If you will allow us, we would like to complete your transaction immediately." Helen closed her book and stood. "Of course." The group moved toward a private office. Employees stepped aside respectfully. Several watched with expressions of embarrassment. Others looked thoughtful. The young teller who had shown kindness earlier received a warm smile from Helen as she passed. Inside the private office, the transaction that had caused so much concern was completed in less than 15 minutes. Every document was valid. Every authorization was correct. There had never been a problem with the paperwork, only with the assumptions surrounding it. When everything was finished, Richard sat across from Helen at the polished conference table. For the first time that day, there were no misunderstandings between them. "May I ask you something?" he said. Helen nodded. "Why did you not tell us who you were?" She smiled. The answer came immediately. "Because it should not matter." Richard sat quietly. Helen folded her hands on the table. Respect should not depend on account balances. It should not depend on titles. It should not depend on appearances. Her voice remained calm. The way we treat people reveals far more about us than it does about them. Richard listened carefully. Every word felt true. Helen continued. "Some of the kindest people I have ever met had very little money. Some of the wealthiest people I have met had very little character. The two things are not the same." The room grew quiet again. There was wisdom in her words that no financial report could teach. Before leaving, Helen thanked the employees who had assisted her throughout the morning. She thanked the young teller for bringing her water. She thanked the receptionist who greeted her at the entrance. She treated everyone with the same respect she wished to receive herself. As she walked toward the front doors, many employees paused to watch. Not because of her wealth, not because of her influence, but because they finally understood the kind of person she was. Outside, the afternoon sun illuminated the city streets. Helen stepped onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the flow of pedestrians. No cameras followed her. No reporters waited nearby. The world continued exactly as before. Yet inside the branch something had changed. In the weeks that followed, new training programs were introduced. Employees were encouraged to focus less on appearances and more on service. Managers revisited the values they claimed to represent. The lesson Helen left behind spread far beyond a single transaction. Years later, some employees would still remember the quiet woman with the worn handbag who entered the bank and asked for nothing more than fair treatment. They would remember how easy it was to judge someone based on appearances. And they would remember how quickly those judgments collapsed when the truth emerged. Because that morning was never really about money. It was about dignity. And long after the numbers were forgotten, everyone who witnessed the event remembered the same lesson. The most important person in the room is often the one nobody notices.